He wasn't there legally, so I went in and bought a uniform at the PX. Big uniform, he's a big fellow. I dressed him up as an army man and took him about and showed him what was going on. Then, of course, I met with other people. I met with Schwartz of the JDC that came down, and with what's his name, Goldberg, with Montor, as he was called, of the UJA that came on his trip. I traveled with all of them, the American Jewish Committee crowd, and conference, Congress, and so forth. People who came during, then showed them exactly what was going on. I wasn't gentle about it. I wasn't particularly gracious. I was constantly angry, harping upon failure of Jewish organizations to provide and to understand precisely what was happening. So I merely said my piece, and they went their way, and I stayed on.
Did you see any results from that?
Oh, I think they were just as interested in the problem as I was, except that I was there, and perhaps I saw it a little differently. Mo Levitt was there, and we got into all kinds of discussions and arguments on what should be done or what can be done and so forth.
But he was with the JDC?
Yes. An old-timer. These are all nice, fine people. It was just a question.
Perhaps we could go into that. What type of arguments did you have with someone like Levitt from the JDC?
Well, I maintained that certain materials that we should have, we didn't get, even though we requested. For example, we constantly requested typewriters, Hebrew typewriters. Never got them. We requested certain medical equipment. We never got it. And I would, in fact, I wrote to a community, New Haven at the time, and got basic medical material that a doctor normally would have.
Why was the JDC disturbed about that?
I don't know. Let's put it this way, that it wasn't provided.
Did you get it from the Army?
Well, we got most of the stuff from the Army, but what we couldn't get from the Army or couldn't pilfer, I mean, not everything was around. Take the question of, we had a big thing going with what's that drug that became popular at that time?
Sulfur? Sulfur?
No. It's used, you're usually asked in an operation whether you're allergic to it.
Sure it's not
penicillin? Penicillin. Penicillin just, that was new. And there was a tremendous demand on penicillin. I had very tragic cases. In our own hospitals, we couldn't get any penicillin. Well, as long as the people didn't know about it, it was all right, but some of the people came to me and demanded, for a wife or a child or something, I need penicillin.
When they go to the JDC, man?
Well, you couldn't get it. In other words, you couldn't get it from anybody. Certainly we tried JDC, but JDC couldn't get this. If JDC could get it, we wouldn't have the problem. And Army wouldn't provide it. Army had a thing about it. But I discovered that the dental clinics were provided with it. They were using it for a different purpose. They were dabbing it on the tooth or something of that sort. And that was a good place to get it. But we had all kinds of problems requesting things, and I'm sure that the organizations could give you a good answer why we didn't get it. Whether we needed ophthalmoscopes or other pieces of equipment, which, for example, the city of New Haven, because I'd been a rabbi there for a short period of time before going to the service, I wrote to them, and I had 6, 7 new doctors, Jewish doctors. How were they going to practice? And I want to make them feel that they're back in the practice. I want to give them the equipment. Couldn't get it, but I got it from the city. They in New Haven sent it to me, and I was able to give it to the doctor. There were all these arguments going on. I'm sure they had a different priority list. They saw the picture differently. I took exception, for example, to social workers coming into the camps that were sent by the Joint, because I felt that they were coming in with a kind of a concept of the case worker, which they did, making studies, which they were all making studies. God, each one left with God knows how many studies. And we were constantly in a crisis situation. We didn't, one social worker comes to me and says, how can you have 150, 200 people living in one room, that is one attic space, without any division, men, women, children? How can I? I mean, the whole thing is, how can you? This is the way the situation sizes up. We have no way of
Are they so naive, so unprepared?
Yes, they too were unprepared. No one really was there and went back to train anybody and say, look, this is what you have, and each one was on her own. And they had to start out with whatever tools they had. Now, there were a number of them who saw immediately that this wasn't the approach, and they became very wonderful workers and worked with me. Oh, yes, there were many of them. These girls, one of them's a doctor out in Chicago, one of them lives here in New York. These were some of the girls. Seal died recently. A number of others. They were basically social workers, but when they saw what the situation was, they kind of changed, and so we had arguments on the kind of approach or the attitude and so forth. Then we got into a whole hassle about creating a currency for the people so that they could earn in terms of their work in camp and so forth, and the joint was going to set this up, and I discussed it with Mo Levitt and so forth, and the whole thing washed out. I'm sure that it was much more difficult than I had realized, but basically these were the kind of discussions we had and arguments. It had nothing to do with anything personal. They may have taken it personally. I'm sure they did. They didn't like the idea that there was this guy running around talking back to a big organization that had a whole history and a big payroll and all that business.
Have we dealt sufficiently with the second period, the DP period of your chaplaincy?
In my second period, my whole approach was different, because here I was a DP chaplain. I didn't have to look over my shoulder to see who's going to suddenly pick me up and cast me out. Here I was there. I was attached to a unit, and it was interesting. There was a colonel in charge, a very nice fellow, typical diplomat.
Names, dates?
Colonel, I think Nelson, something of that sort. But he had no interest or understanding of the situation. He was cruel to the people. He thought he was being humorous. And he had a team around him. Most of them kind of followed his lead, except for the executive officer, who was a kind of a serious guy. And I was attached to this unit. This whole business was just a nuisance for them, but on the other hand, it was a pretty good assignment. We didn't have to put up with the total military structure, had our own little units and so forth. And the only two jobs they really had was to count the people, so that the food would be determined, and to raid the camps, make sure there was no black market. As it turned out, they thought they did the counting, and I did the counting. I could have saved them all the trouble. They didn't have to go out and spend time. I could have given them the number before they went. As far as raids were concerned, they were mostly unsuccessful, because I knew when every raid was going to take place, and I got to the camp first, and camps were cleaned up.
So the second period doesn't seem to be very eventful.
Yes, it was eventful in a different sort of way.
Okay.
Here it was eventful because I now was dealing directly with the people themselves, where in the first period I was dealing for them. Here I was dealing with them. And all the strange behavioral patterns began to manifest themselves, just as I told you about the whorehouse. The concept of justice.
That was strange, the whorehouse?
German women.
Oh, German women, that's
Yeah.
right.
When you make all these speeches against the Germans, our enemies and so forth, and then suddenly find you have a right adjacent to a camp, one of our installations. Or, for example, the concept of justice. A committee came to see me one day, Castle, and they told me that there was fish available for purchase. fresh fish. So I said, fine, how much? And they told me how much. I said, fine, I'll get the money for you. And so I provided them with the money, and they went and they bought the fish. And it was sold in the camp, and the camp had fresh fish. One day I'm driving through an area, and I see a fish hatchery. And I go over, and I drive in, I talk to the man, you have fish here? Yeah. He says, well, who eats this fish? Oh, this is government control. Who buys it? How do you buy it? Can I buy it? I have people in a camp. What can? Tell him. He says, oh, we sell you fish. So you do? Yeah, he takes out his books, and he shows me the entry of the fish that was sold to the camp. And I see the price. And I realized that I had been taken, that it was a government-controlled price, and they had charged me the black market price. So I go to the camp, and I call the camp police, and I tell the camp police I want the quarters of this fellow raided, and everything confiscated, which they do, and they confiscated the money. And now they've turned it over to me. And I have a delegation from the camp, comes to see me in Castle, and they tell me that I did a very bad thing. That here was a man who was industrious, found the fish, bought it, brought fish to the camp, and instead of my being grateful, I raided his apartment and had the money confiscated. Now they said it would be a good thing if you gave him back the money. So I said to him, no, I can't do that. After all, this was government fish, and we are entitled to it. We're technically not entitled to it, but I could have gotten it for you. I can get more fish for you. I see no reason to take this money, which I have to raise one way or the other, to pay black market prices for it. So it was decided we're going to have a court case, a regular court case, to decide just how to...
Who's the judge?
The party system would decide this. So the court was set up, and you had a battle to begin with. You had the religious bloc against the others, and the thing that was involved was the testimony, who would testify, and whether the wife of the man would testify. And since the religious bloc didn't want the wife to testify, we had a whole hassle, and so we ended up with two juries and a panel of judges, and the case was heard, and the verdict that was rendered was that it is true that he had overcharged for the fish. However, since he had performed this service for the camp, he's entitled to the money. And so they came to Castle to tell me about the judgment, and I refused to give up the money. At which point they said it was embarrassing for us, then we'll have to resign our office, because after all we had held the court. At this point, of course, they were technically correct, except that I was determined that I wasn't going to use that money for that fish, and so that's the way it remained. Yes. There were many such incidents which...
So what happened? How did that...
I just didn't return it. That was the end of that. I just stood my ground. Then we had another interesting situation in the same category, and then I'll touch upon something else. I was in a camp. I had been a prisoner of war camp before the Jews were brought north there and entered the camp.
What year was this?
This is in 47. I was in the camp, and one of the DPs in the camp was following me as I walked through the camp, and he had a little package in his hand. He was complaining. And finally, when I turned around, he showed me something, and he said, "This is the kind of bread they feed us in this camp." When I looked at it, it was a strange-looking thing. It had the outer core of a loaf of bread, but inside it looked like putty. squishy. So I get angry immediately. I figure, how can they feed people this kind of stuff? So I know that bread is delivered by the Army, and I hold the Army responsible. So I go back to Kassel and I begin to search out the process of bread, who, what, when. Finally, I come to a place, and this is the GI bakery. I walk in, there was a sergeant there, and I put the bread down in front of him, and I said, is this the kind of bread you feed these people? A very nice chap. Turns around, takes out a book called Bread Diseases. And he begins to leaf through it. I didn't know that there were such things as bread diseases. And he turns to a section called rope disease. It's when you cut a slice of bread and pull it away, you see little fibers or strings attached to it and so forth. But still, this didn't explain it. He'd never seen anything like it, this putty effect of bread inside the loaf. And we spent time searching his records in terms of different ingredients. How could this happen to the bread? And finally, he looked up and he said, tell me again where you got this. And I told him. He says, oh, he says, let me tell you, we don't bake bread for that camp. I said, what do you mean you don't? Well, we had a delegation came here. And they said to us that we can't bake bread for them because they need Jewish bread. So I began to understand what has happened here. I didn't carry it any further. I thanked him, and I went back to the camp, and I got into the committee room with the committee members. I dropped the bread in front of them, and I demanded an answer about the bread. And as the answer came out, it was as follows. They had gone to the GI bakery and asked for the flour instead of the baked bread. And they were given the flour. However, in the rations delivered to camp, there was also a lot of cereal. And our people didn't like these cereals. And they were stacked in their warehouses. And they took their flour to a local bakery to bake. So some of the camp people thought it would be profitable if they would mix the cereal with the flour and take off flour and sell it on the black market. And of course, that's what happened. He brought it to the baker. It had a cereal in it, and that accounted for the inside of the bread. Well, the news got out right away that the committee people were thieves and so forth. And so they were arrested. And they were arrested in the camp prison. And the people were agitated. And there were all kinds of speeches being made, take them out and hang them up and so forth. And I didn't want anything to happen to them. And so I decided that I was going to take them to Kassel and put them in jail in Kassel. Except I couldn't get them out because the people in the camp wouldn't let me take them. They said if I took them, I'd let them go eventually. And they want them hung up, just talking wild. So I sent for the military police. Well, this is the worst thing you really can do. After all, the military police is the enemy. And if I sent for the military police, boy, that's bad. Except I had no choice. And so the military police came, and we forced our way into the building and took them out, and they were taken to Kassel, and I had them put in jail. Then I ran into another problem. The problem then was to keep them in jail. And so one of the judges called me and said, I'll be glad to keep them, but you have to prefer charges. I said, I don't want to prefer charges. I just want to get the flour back. He said, I'd like to help you, but we can't do it. I said, well, keep them as long as you can. In the meantime, there was a chap in Kassel, a fellow named Schwartz, who was the head of of the UNRWA team. He's a very fine guy, very sensitive guy. So I went to see him, or we talked about it, and he said, let me try. And by this time, the families of these guys were at the military post where we were, and the mothers were bringing their children, but made sure that they were half undressed. This was an old trick. The tuchus hanging out of every child. And Schwartz took over. And he simply said to them, do you want your husbands? Yes. And he gave them a time, 12 hours, 24 hours. If in 24 hours you deliver here to the Castle military post so many and so many sacks of flour, they'll be out. And that's precisely what happened. Now, to give you the epilogue. Eventually, I moved the people from this camp, which was a prisoner of war camp, to the Castle military post because we were ordered out of the Castle military post. It was to be turned back to the economy, German economy, and I made a fuss about it. I raised such a stink that it was heard all the way to Frankfurt. The military post was a solid place with solid brick buildings, and we were going to get out. They wanted the army out of there. And here were these people out in these prisoner of war cages, really. And I pictured the Germans being given back these facilities. And it got to a point where the army was so embarrassed that they finally said to me, okay, take the camp. And so I now moved the people from the surrounding camps into the
Do you remember when that was?
47, 48. It was one of the most disheartening experiences of my life.
They didn't want to move.
Well, it wasn't that they didn't want to move. A lot of them didn't want to move. The first series of vehicles that I sent up, they stole the gasoline, that is the return gasoline, sold it on the black market. As I brought the people in, they faked the space. You know, we had the space portioned out. We knew exactly how much space it was. The political parties took buildings, floors. We even had a group that walled up certain entrances so that the rooms wouldn't show. Now, just to give you the last little bit, when they were settled in the Castle military post and elections took place, the very same people that were involved in the bread deal were elected officers. So here you had, in this particular period, a whole different ballgame. Here I could tell you incident after incident about some amusing, some... there were cases, we had another situation where in one camp, the left wing, by this time you had the parties with the red flag, and whenever that red flag came up, the army saw red. They didn't understand the red flag. They didn't, this whole concept of the Labor Party. And the CIC, which is the intelligence, wrote reports which were fantastic. I used to read them, and I couldn't believe that there could be such misunderstanding of the situation. And there was a riot of some sort in one camp. I don't recall at the moment what caused it, except that the military had to be called in, and there was quite a bit of damage done. And some maybe 15 or 18 people were arrested. And they were going to be tried. And the commanding officer, not of the post now, but of the region, whatever the region, asked me to sit in on the trials. And the reason for it was to make sure, because at this time everybody was sensitive about the treatment of DPs, to make sure that everything was done properly. In the meantime, my commanding officer, this colonel, was put in charge of investigating the case and presenting the charges. So I went down with him. And we met with the people, and since I was the interpreter and they were speaking Yiddish, I carried on 2 conversations. First of all, I talked to them and told them what the nonsense was all about and how to straighten it out, and then I would talk to the colonel. Except they outsmarted themselves. At one point, I insisted upon a matter of procedure. And the people then said to the colonel, if I was going to be there as the interpreter to the colonel, they wanted their own interpreter. And so now we have another interpreter. In the meantime, every time a question came up, it seemed that the leader had to go into another room to talk to somebody about it. And I got tired of this nonsense, and I walked into the other room, and I found them huddled around a telephone, calling Frankfurt, the shlichim in Frankfurt, to get instructions. And all I was saying to them is they were headed for a lot of trouble. The whole thing could have been resolved very simply. So I got angry, and I pulled the telephone out of the wall. At this point, they indicated to the colonel that they wouldn't proceed with the case as long as I was involved. And so I stepped out, which was a good thing, because I was only there because I was asked by the commanding officer, and I knew this would come to naught. Well, as it turned out, they were tried, they were found guilty, and they were all sent to jail. And immediately they sent for me. And of course, when I came into the jail, they were sorry and forget everything, get us out. So I then went back to the judge and discussed it with him and pointed out that we'll accomplish nothing here. And so he then gave me a kind of a schedule that I could work with in getting them out one by one. Instead of letting them all together, take the oldest first, take the husbands first, and so forth. It was very nice. In a very short time, we got them all out. And this happened prior to 48 partition. And when partition was proclaimed, this camp was the first to come to me to ask me to speak at a big rally to which all the American officers were invited. And they all came, because it became a big thing. And I was to express the thanks of the people and to explain to them what Israel means to them and so forth. And that I did. And I felt that with that speech, my career in Germany was over. So this is that was the point where I knew that it was time to go. And shortly thereafter, I don't know how long it took, but shortly thereafter I left.
Okay. Is there anything else that you, an overall characterization of the role of the chaplain during this period of time?
The overall characterization is that those chaplains that I know that worked with me, either tangentially or our paths crossed, like Wall and Lippman and Herb Friedman, each one did some interesting and good work. It's not for me to try to outguess history and say what would have happened had we not been there. The facts are that we were there, and each one of us in a given role did certain things, and what its total effect was, I don't know. I have the feeling that people themselves have resources far beyond those that we give them credit for. Somehow they are able to reach out and to affect the course of their lives.
But how would they have been able to...
At a price, though. In other words, sooner or later they would have fought the guards at the gates, and perhaps a few would have been killed, and other things would have happened. Eventually, of course, somehow what they were looking for, they were entitled to. It wasn't anything that was to be given to them as a gift from anyone. Identity, freedom, mobility, the right to be, and so forth. These things would have gotten to them one way or the other, except perhaps the price would have been a little too high. Just as had we come in a day earlier in Dachau, perhaps a few more would be alive. We'd come in and not attended to the needs. Let me tell you one other little story, which I think is fascinating because it affected my career too. Perhaps I would have been one of the chaplains that came and then left. When I walked into one of the barracks in Dachau for the first time, first of all, the odor was tremendous. The odor of death, decayed flesh, and so forth. For a person who hasn't lived in this odor, it's a terrifying experience because it affects your stomach and churn. And it takes time. You have to fight it. It's like a wall. And it was a fearful experience because I didn't know how they would respond to me. And secondly, I had nothing to offer them. It was an embarrassing situation. And I came in, and when they became aware that I was there, they began to move towards me, especially when they saw the insignia of the chaplain's Ten Commandments. And they were a little bit hesitant, but they kept their eyes on me, and I said a word in Yiddish, a word in Hebrew, and they began to respond a little bit. And
you were the first Jew they had seen.
No, they may have seen other chaplains coming in and
right,
out.
right.
I'm not, I don't know. It's, after all, chaplains came and went. Who saw whom, I don't know. But if you talk to Bonin, I'm sure he told you he saw these. He didn't, maybe the ones in bed hadn't seen anybody yet because they weren't up on their feet. But some of them were mobile. They walked around. And so little by little, a word here, a word there. And then they began to open up, where are you from? And, do I know so-and-so? And, you know, to them, Cincinnati is a street. Do you know anybody there? A little story here, my brother left, and so on. And as I walked about, I noticed they were a little respectful of one figure. It was stretched out in a, you know, this was a kind of bunks. And they kind of shied away, always forming a kind of a circle around him, while the others, you know, in front of the others, they push in front of me and begin to, each one of his voice above the other. And finally I turned to this man and I said hello, and yes, I'm happy that we came and all that, and we had a word here, a word there. And after a word or two, he says to me, he says, I don't know, in Yiddish you're speaking. He said, you know, I had a brother, and my brother left our town many years ago, and he's been in America, and he's a rabbi in America. Maybe you know who he is. And before he told me his name, I knew exactly who he was. I could see the face and the voice. And I had just left him. He came over in the same contingent with me and was in Nuremberg. And I said to him, Shapiro. Rabbi Shapiro. Yes, he calls himself Spyro.
Oh.
He should be on your list.
Yes.
Shapiro. I says, I will get your brother for you. So then he said to me, very interesting, he says, you are not allowed to appease a sick man with false words. So I told him that I had just been with his brother. I sent for him, went up to Nuremberg, found him, and brought him back. This was important because up to that moment, I didn't know of what use I could be. But the interesting thing is that after that moment, no matter what I did, was on the plus side. See, I had already accomplished something. My very being and this relationship and so forth, that from there on it became, this made the whole period after that very simple in terms of making decisions and so forth. And perhaps had something to do with my next major decision, which is told by Bauer, how I got back to Dachau. Spyro, he was there. You can get part of his story, too. He was in the Nuremberg area. I forgot all about him.
when you were there as a chaplain, the question I'm trying to ask is that if you or the other chaplains hadn't been there, was the Army taking care of them the way they should have?
No. No.
So then we can say...
Yes, we can say one of a number of things. First of all, if I hadn't been there, and perhaps some of the other chaplains, the attention that they deserved would not have been given to them. We forced the issue.
And thousands would have died.
What would have happened to those, we don't know. Secondly, the decisions that were made would not have been made. They may have been made later. I'm sure the advisors to the president would not have been appointed. After all, we created the storm, and we made issue of it. The DPs themselves weren't going to write the letters. The news wouldn't have gotten out. So in that sense, yes. In other words, we perhaps shortened the time. We got the Army to attend to the problem, to resolve certain situations. I could see where it weren't for the chaplains, where many Jews coming from Hungary and other Axis countries would have suffered terribly.
Do you want to go into that?
They would suffer simply because they were the Army hadn't distinguished between the DP and the enemy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see.
You see,
Yeah, okay.
we had to force this issue. So, yes, I would say that there would have been another time element, and to that extent.
Well, time was really important during.
That is correct at that point. Well, there are many little things, of course, which in the larger picture become little. For example, the wall in the Deutsches Museum. We had taken a long corridor, which in its good day, I imagine, was an exhibit corridor.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a first floor landing. We had to build the stairwell up to it because it had been bombed. There were no windows or anything, except the wall to the right was a solid white wall. And the windows were on the left. And we had built the offices right along the corridor. Part of it. Towards the rear, it was all bombed. And as people came through, this became the center for all movement. We had out in the lobby always a copy of Sherita Plata. Now, we had 1,000 copies made, but we never distribute these copies. What happened was that we would take a copy out into the hall and put it down. In a few moments, it would disappear. Then what we would do is nail it down. Take a hammer and nail it down, and then they would, page by page, would disappear. And so we kept feeding the copies and so forth, and people would study them and so forth. And then after they'd studied it and found nothing they were looking for, they would walk into this big room, the hall, and they would make a note on the wall saying, I was here and so forth. And we then began to collect the material off the walls. And this became a kind of a wall. And one of the fights I had with the officer that was going to court-martial me was over this wall. And I tried to explain this wall to him, but he couldn't see it, how important the wall is.
I can't think of anything else at the moment.
Very good.
We've only talked for about 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Well,
thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.